Welcome back into the room. I hope you enjoyed the cake and coffee. We are in the final stretch. One more presentation and then a quiz where you can win awesome prizes if you paid attention. So, but before that, we will have Theo talking about tips for IP transit customers. Please give him a big hand.
Ooh. Thanks. Thanks, perfect. Hello everyone, my name is Theo and I'm standing between you, the quiz and the weekend, so I think it's the worst spot on the agenda, so I'm trying to keep the 350 slides short and don't make this longer than needed. This is not my presentation actually, it's a presentation of a colleague that is unfortunately sick today and I try to cover this as good as I can. Very quick intro, I'm an ex-engineer, now co-founder of Inter.link. We're doing fully automated, sustainable IP, layer 2 and other stuff, and try to do this from engineers for engineers. And we have quite some experience with building, running, automating, and selling IP transit. And we learned a couple of things about the last 1.5, 2 years. And that's some lessons learned that I want to share. This is not a presentation about RPKI or ASPA or anything else. I think it's BGP, IR related, and it's definitely not a presentation about what we aim for as the gold standard. It's lessons learned and should kind of give a few insights in what would make provisioning IP transit a bit easier for everybody. And it's a lot of small fixes that we discovered everybody can just make in a couple of minutes, seconds. That just help us on the way to what Job is advocating for, which is perfect routing security at some point. So when we provision 900 something services, not all of them were live customers, some of them were test services, but a decent percentage of those provision services failed while provisioning. And why did they fail? Because we have it automated, so we rely on good data to do so. So whenever the data is shit, it fails. And that is something we spend a lot of resources on to just improve, talk to customers, educate, and that's what I'm going to kind of have a look at today. As I said, it's IRR-based right now. That is what most operators, most IXs, a lot of networks use. This isn't the future, but as I said, there's a lot of kind of small stuff that we can do. So quick recap, we will have a look at how prefix filter generation works for most networks as of today. We will have a look at the data sources that are being used, what sources to use in your network, what trusted sources to use, and in the end, a bit of a excursus into how make the data readable for everybody. So first, when we look at prefix filters and how it's being done, then usually the life of a customer that wants to purchase IP transit or does peering is the customer registers an ASN, in this case this one here, creates an autonom object for that, and that in the next step leads to a route object that has a certain origin set for that network. And then in the third step, usually that customer creates hopefully an AS set and make that ASN that was registered earlier part of that AS set as a member. And then, and this is what we do internally, we build somewhat of a tree. We say, hey, this customer has that AS set, that AS member, and that is the prefix that we're going to retrieve, or that is the prefix that the customer is going to announce to us. And then the funny step comes. The customer goes into our portal, clicks IP transit, blah, 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 and provisions the service and puts in data. And usually that starts by putting in the AS number. And then we are trying to get data from that customer to finally retrieve what prefixes is the customer going to announce to us and make that part of our AS set as well. And that then leads to this hierarchical tree. We have our AS set, customer AS, and customer prefix finally. And yes, V6 here. And then when we use a tool, for example, like BGP Q4, we pull the AS set of the customer, we retrieve the prefix, and that says, hey, this prefix is what we're going to accept. And we'll talk about this in a second, but you see I highlighted the word probably, and that will play a key role in the failure and the success we had with that data. And one of the challenges we also encountered was that with 900 services being provisioned and so on and so forth, the data adds up. It's a lot of customers from different regions, different type of customers, enterprises, ISPs, all across Europe. And that is the next challenge that comes in when you do a lot of transit. So when we look at an AS set and look at the prefixes, and we used IRR3 here, we try to get an idea, again, idea in red, of the total number of prefixes. So for example, AS545, AS Inter.link, gives you 6,000 ASNs and roughly 46,000 prefixes that we cover across our customer cone. So the next step is what data sources should we use to get that data from? And the two things that I mentioned earlier, we use BGPQ4 to probably get all the customer prefixes, and we use IRR3 to get an idea of the number of prefixes. And why do I use probably an idea? Because that's a quite challenging thing. So the problem statement we came across was first, I need to get your AS set. So the usual source we would look for is PeeringDB. First challenge, not all of you have a PeeringDB record. That's the first thing that we tell customers, please get that fixed, have a record where you put data in that we can even use. Because if the customer goes to our portal, wants to order stuff automatically, puts in the AS number, and there's no PeeringDB record, then that's the first blocker usually that we encounter. And the second step is, where do we get the AS set from if there's no PeeringDB record, or if there is a PeeringDB record which contains data that we cannot read? And also, when we look at the prefix data that we want to gather, we have to look at a lot of IR databases. That is, I haven't counted them even, but it's dozens of databases. And not all of them are authoritative, not all of them are trusted. So what do we do internally? We run IRRD servers locally. We mirror the IRR databases. We do not mirror all of them, but a certain subset of them. And we query our IRRD service internally. Why that? Because if you run prefix filter updates every now and then, not just nightly, but also if customers are onboarded, you're going to get into scaling issues at some point. And also, it helps us have just all the data in one place, build a redundant setup that we can use to query the data. But then we have customers that created two AS sets. They have one AS set, for example, here with AS Apple, they have it in ArrayDB, and they have it in RIPE. So the question is, which one should we use? We can, of course, ask the customer, but it would be nicer if the customer can somehow automatically tell us if there is a need for two, which one to use. And when we look at this AS Apple thing here, we see that we have an AS set in RIPE that is actually empty. And we have an AS set in RARDB, which it looks like contains the prefixes that Apple plans to announce. Again, which one to use? And there's a couple examples. I think one is listed here. I think, Job, you were involved as well here. When somebody squatted the AS set of Amazon, created one in RIPE that was just dummy or like fake data, and the original one is in RARDB. So potentially you can just pay, I don't know, $500 a year to RARDB and just create your own AS set. There's other databases like AltDB where I think you just have to register, create an AS set, and that's it. So how can we make customers tell us which AS set we should use if there is multiple out there created by the customer, or if there's multiple out there created by the customer and someone trying to hijack or fake or impersonate the customer? And that brings us to the next step. So when you look at this record here, we see that Apple has just said, hey, we have AS Apple. Apple doesn't tell us which IRR source they say is authoritative for their AS set. Google, on the other hand, says, by the notation on the right, guys, please use ArrayDB for generating the prefix list for me. And that is something that is relatively easy to add, because most of you, I guess, have just one AS set in one IRR database. Why not telling us that this is the data to use? And yes, IR is not perfect, but it's just a tiny little thing you can do to at least improve it a little bit. And I think towards the 100% of routing security that people in this room are advocating for, every percentage that we improve that is just simple to do is something that we should do. And then the next thing is, and I pulled some data from, or we pulled some data from PeeringDB here, is that there is no definition on how to define your AS set in PeeringDB. So some use the colon, some use an @ symbol, and we see that the dominant thing is the colon. So what you can do is just easy. Go to PeeringDB. If you have just a single AS set, just add the source to PeeringDB that your AS set is authoritative, or the database that your AS set sits in. So let's have a look at the sources as a next step. So this is one example here where somebody created an AS set. In this case, it was us, but somebody could have created an AS set in a database that has just the same name. So you create an AS set that is AS Inter.link in the database, and we're going to pull this and then have to decide what data to take from that. So what a couple of RIRs have done is they have enforced hierarchical AS sets in their databases. And UpNIC and RIPE are doing it. LUCNIC apparently job has forced them magically to do it. I haven't found any other source publicly, but there's at least 3 RIRs that in their databases enforce you to just create an AS set that contains your AS number and then your AS set. And that at least improves, again, routing security a tiny little bit. So if you don't have a hierarchical AS set, please do so and create it in any of the databases. So ideally, we would transition from AS Apple to RIDB AS Google to, at some point, RIPE AS 5405 AS Inter.link. That would tell us, please, AS Inter.link you can find in the RIPE database. That's the authoritative source we say it is. It's beyond or behind AS 5405, and that gives additional clarity, but also increases routing security. And also important, that doesn't even require you to make any big changes. It's just a definition of where's your data and what should we use. So please, if you haven't done that yet in RIPE, and if the situation is easy, if you're a PeeringDB administrator, just make that change when possible to make things easy. So the next step is which sources are actually trusted. And IRR, Job and I agreed on this, isn't a trusted system, but there are sources that are less trusted and more trusted. So when you look at the RIR databases that have no authentication and you check how many AS sets do you have in PeeringDB for those, AltDB, Level 3, RIDB, that you can just pay for or even get it for free, it's quite a bit. It's 500 records that use IRR sources that are not considered trusted. So what you can do is you can move your AS set actually in a source that is trusted, and you can add the source into your PeeringDB record, you can make it hierarchical, and that is another step to make it not just easier for us, but again, improve routing security a tiny little bit. So that brings us to the last part of what I think is something that would really help, is formatting. Because when you look at the AS field in PeeringDB, and that's maybe something we should talk to PeeringDB about improving, which we haven't done yet, honestly, is looking at the format of the AS set field. So I have a couple examples, a few slides later, but you will see that there is companies that put a comma in between 2 AS sets, for example. There's companies that put a white space between the 2 AS sets. There's companies who don't even. So there's no formatting rules for this field. And that makes it even harder. If you run automation against PeeringDB and you get 50 different formats, that breaks. So what we see, for example, we see, and I haven't anonymized the networks here, but you see there's people that put like a V6 in the end. There's people who have just a 6 in the end. There is even completely different AS sets in there. And there's also companies that put different AS sets for different purposes, like customers and so on in there. So again, when you automate against PeeringDB, which one are you using? So please make it easier for us and everybody else. Just make the data clear and unique. And that goes further on. You can have, like, as you see here, some route servers have different AS sets, for example, per peering LAN, which makes it easier to just pull the EKIX routes for Berlin. Does it even exist anymore? I don't know. But the same goes for peering lines and also different peering lines. Yeah. And the next example that I brought is like sometimes there is aspa at ripe, colon, and even without. So just make that unique that we can read it automatically. Yeah, so quick recap towards the end. First step is create that hierarchical AS set, add a source to your AS set in PeeringDB, please. And also importantly, please talk to a provider or use a peering partner, IX or whatever, that also honors that value. And move your AS set into one of the IRR DBs and also consolidate your PeeringDB record into one AS set. And I think that's it. Any questions? Everybody would like to get to the quiz?
Not even one? No?
Ah, I knew it. Go on.
Is it on? It is on. Can you go back to the slide with the table of the IRRs and their status on hierarchical naming enforcement? Right. So LACNIC was fixed because right from the get-go, when they first deployed an IRR daemon, which was just a few years ago, they asked me like, hey Joe, what should we do? And I was like, hey, why don't you just right from the start make it proper? And like, yeah, that seems reasonable. And then the RIPE community was approached with a proposal to enforce hierarchical naming for new objects, and that worked out great. They implemented it in the span of a few weeks. Aaron has a mechanism called the ACSP process, where community members can make a suggestion for Aaron to do something. So since I already covered 2 out of 5, why don't you submit the form and...
I mean, Aaron, I take it. Afrinic, given recent developments, might be a bit more challenging, but...
We'll flip a coin on Afrinic.
Yeah. No, Aaron, challenge accepted. Yeah, I mean, it's a good thing. Let's do it.
Why I'm pointing this out, the only way we get the needle to move in any direction is to go to vendors. Sometimes that's me going to a transit provider, and sometimes that's you as transit provider going to an RAR. Thank you for the presentation.
Hi, I'm Alan Ising, a random person from the street, or Telia. I was wondering, you had a slide where you basically wrote that you wrote your own database to sort of mirror all of these various WHOIS databases and sources out there. Is this a good solution to recommend to people? Is there any other approaches?
We use IRRD, so we do not run our own software.
But you have your own database you aggregate into. The reason I'm asking is because if I'm doing an automation of a transit provider, I need all this information here, and it's vastly different how I access all of these WHOIS databases.
I think it's a scaling question, and depending on the size of the network. I remember in the very early days, like 10-ish years ago, we just pulled public data or public IR databases, ran into rate limits. That's one thing on their side, but also depending on the number of equipment, routers, systems you have internally. So I think that's something that really depends on what your network looks like. And and of course, long term, I think we should transition to other stuff than IR databases.
Jan Gronemann, also a random person off the street. I was looking at the presentation earlier. Why did you remove the cat?
Simple thing. I'm not the person for memes, and that's the main thing why I adopted slides, since they were not mine. So you have to have, the colleague of mine gave that at DKNOG as well. That's a presentation that you can watch, the recording with a lot of memes. Maybe that's more fun, but not my style.
All right, thank you.
But it looks nicer, I think, now.
You mentioned that you were having issues with input validation and the difference between the @ and the 2 colons. Can I set mine as close quote, semicolon, drop table roots, please? Do you have enough validation for that? And also 2-factor authentication?
I mean, when it comes to data input in PeeringDB, I think you can. I mean, we heard that earlier. PeeringDB is going to be behind two-factor authentication. I think there is validation by humans before you create objects in PeeringDB. I think that's yes. Honestly, I have not validated how the process of taking that data into, for example, IRD, how secure or how kind of good that checking works. That's maybe something that Job can take on for the next presentation.
Well, give Theo a big round of applause.
Thanks.
Thank you.